On this Super Review Live, however you want to say it, I should probably tell you how to say that. Anyway, on this review, we're going to take a look at the Philips Fidelio X3. So this is an over-ear, open-back headphone, and you probably already know that if you're watching this review. If you don't know what that means, I don't know, ask somebody, because I'm not going to go through that too much. But what this is the follow-up to Philips' fairly popular Philips X2, the Fidelio X2. And I've actually got the X2. I've had it for a number of years, and I was pretty interested when Philips announced the X3. So here we've got it. It's a $350 headphone, so it's not cheap. But yeah, I know. I wanted to spend like the last couple of weeks. In fact, I got this like late August. So I've spent almost a month with the Fidelio X3, comparing it to the original, well, not the original, but the last X2s, as well as comparing it to some other headphones in this price range, because at $350, there's some pretty stiff competition, frankly. You know, these things don't just have to compare or compete against their last generation product. They've got to compete against the best stuff at $350. And in my opinion, that stuff is the Hifiman Sundara and the Sennheiser HD600. So over the past few weeks, I've been listening to these things, comparing them with those other two headphones, going back and forth. And now I'm ready to let you know what I think about this headphone. I'm gonna start, this review by talking about the build quality, just going over the physical aspects of this headphone. And then I'm gonna go into the sound signature and some comparisons between those three headphones. Then I'll wrap up this review with a review score. Everyone loves a score. And I don't know, if anyone else is interested, at the end of the review, I'm gonna do sort of a live Q&A with the audience that's here watching live. This is a live stream. If you stick around to the end, you'll get that live Q&A. If you don't care about the Q&A, that's fine. You'll get your score about 15, 20 minutes in and you should be happy. But for the rest of you, let's go ahead and dive into the review of the Fidelio X3. And as promised, I have those other two headphones here. Here we've got the Hifiman Sundara. Here we've got the Sennheiser HD600. And here we've got the Fidelio X3. So, I don't know, again, like I said, I'm gonna start with the build quality and just kind of talking about the physical aspects. I'm not gonna compare that too much to these two headphones, more I'm gonna compare the sound, but we can, start with the aesthetics of the Fidelio X3. And I think it's actually kind of neat because, these are a little bit more traditional looking headphones. Philips went for, I think, a pretty unique look here with the X3s, and I don't actually know if I love it. I think that it's sort of modern in a year 2020 sort of way. It's like, kind of looks like almost like an Apple, what do you even call the Apple speaker? Whatever that Apple speaker is, or like a Google Home, right? Just like this cloth covered material. It's nice material. It feels pretty nice in the hands. And then up here on the headband, you do have actual genuine leather. Like if I give it the smell test, nobody wanted to hear that, but you just did. It actually is pretty nice smelling real leather, which is cool. And it's not just leather here wrapped around this metal band. There's also leather wrapped around this sort of suspension strap as well. Yeah, I don't know. Aesthetically, I think it looks pretty nice. I actually kind of like the look of the X2 a little bit better than the look of the X3, but I don't know, that's splitting hairs, and really the only reason I'm comparing them is because they both have X in the name. But yeah, I just on its own, I think the X3 is a pretty handsome looking headphone. Again, I think that the styling is maybe a little bit, it's gonna date itself, I think, to 2020. I think in like 5 years, this thing's gonna look old, but I think in about 15 years, which, this headphone, the Sennheiser HD600, kind of in a similar spot, frankly. I think in 15 years, this headphone's gonna look really cool. Yeah, that's sort of the aesthetic. Now let's talk about that build quality, right? So I did mention that the cloth and the fabric feels pretty nice and you got real leather up here. I think that, okay, I alluded to in 15 years from now, I think this whole thing will look cool. I think it's actually gonna last that long too, because the materials, everything here feels nice and sturdy, which I can't necessarily say for the Hifiman here, unfortunately. Yeah, I think it's very sturdy. The build quality is solid. You do have removable ear pads, just like with the Fidelio X2. In fact, it uses the same sort of mechanism, which you can see here, this sort of like 4-pin mechanism. So it's not gonna fit your traditional ear pads unless you, figure out some way to, I don't know, rig them onto some sort of mount like this, but you can at least, ostensibly get replacement pads from Philips. and put them back on. It's a very easy snapping process as long as you got the pins attached, which is usually easier than I just demonstrated right there. Let's see, what else can we say about this build material? I mean, one thing worth calling out is the pads. They are a nice sort of soft recovery or a slow recovery memory foam, which is nice, just like the pads on the X2s. I think that, so these pads are actually swappable with the X2 pads, although they are physically a little bit different. I tried swapping them back and forth just once, and I didn't notice like any immediate effects on the sound. So I don't know that sonically there's much difference, but there's just some like physical difference in terms of kind of how the back of this thing tapers into the cup. Maybe more of an aesthetic thing. But if you want to take pads from this headphone, put them on your X2s, that's going to be perfectly fine. You do still have this velour material, which I'm kind of two minds of. My favorite material for a headphone pad is actually probably like a micro suede, which is very similar to this velour, but I like the micro suede better generally than velour. Velour just tends to be, has a couple of problems, and these are problems I did have with the X3. Problem number one is that they will collect a fair amount of lint. Just kind of in everyday use, if you've got a cat, these things are going to collect cat hair. If you have a dog, they're going to collect dog hair. If you have hair, they're probably going to collect your hair, frankly. It was an issue I had with the X2s as well, and it seemed just about the same as here on the X3s. You know, the Sennheiser HD600s also have velour pads, and I don't have quite as bad an issue, but these things will still collect lint. The other downside to this velour material, and this is a problem I don't actually have with the Sennheisers, but I do have with the X3s, is it's just a little bit on the scratchy side. Maybe I'll just, throw it on my head so you can see how scratchy it is. It's not like super scratchy or anything like that, but it's the sort of thing that if you're moving this thing around your head and like trying to find the right position, you can kind of feel it just sticking into your cheek skins, if you got cheek skins. So there is that. Otherwise, I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, but around here, around the cup, this is just kind of like an all metal bracket, which is nice. I'm sure there's plastic like underneath here, and maybe there's some plastic hidden underneath here, but for the most part, everything that you touch here on the X3 is just nice premium materials. You get that metal, you get that cloth, and you get that genuine leather, which is nice. Unfortunately, I don't know that for comfort, I don't think that it comes through or doesn't really deliver on that premium build material. So for comfort wise, basically my biggest issues are that scratchiness I talked about with the velour ear pads, but also one other issue. So we do have this suspension strap up top, and frankly, I'm a big fan of suspension straps as a design. I like just being able to grab the headphone, pluck it on my head, and not have to worry about if it readjusted itself or unadjusted itself when I took it off last time, or someone else picked up my headphone and has a smaller head than me and readjusted it. That's really annoying. You don't have to worry about that with a suspension strap like this. Unfortunately, the suspension strap here is just a little bit tight, surprisingly tight, frankly. Like it's like pulling itself up. It's the sort of thing that might wear in over time, frankly. I wouldn't be surprised if that got looser over time, but I've lived with this for about a month and it feels still about as tight as it was when I first got it. So I don't know, take that with a grain of salt. You could complain that something like the HD600 has too tight a clamp force, which again is the sort of thing that wears out over time. And I expect that this suspension strap will wear in a little bit over time, but I can just say at least so far it hasn't. And so it just means that strapping into this headphone is a bit of an intense experience. Once it's there, it's fairly, it's lightweight and it disappears. I think weight-wise, this fits somewhere in between the Sennheisers and the Sundaras. The Sundaras being the heavier, the Sennheisers being a little bit lighter, and these kind of, again, being somewhere in between. But yeah, I didn't really have any issues with clamp force this way. It was pretty solid, maybe a little bit stronger clamp force than what you get on the Fidelio X2s, but those have kind of a weak clamp force, frankly. So that's the build materials and comfort. What are some other things I should talk about? I mean, I could talk about some of the stuff that came in the box. I don't have the cable on these things. Just to clarify, again, If you're watching this video, you probably already know this, but just in case, this is not a Bluetooth headphone. It does require connecting it to a cable, and I do have that cable right here, which is just, in my opinion, way too long. So let's go to the table just so I can kind of show you what I've done with the cable to make it usable. As I've wound it up and kind of strapped it together like this. I don't know, I've got it at maybe, you know, traditional 4-foot length. I prefer this length personally, but having this big wad of cable at the end, not necessarily ideal. It is, you know, at least, you know, it's a fairly standard connection type, right? So on the bottom of the X2s, you do have these dual 3.5 millimeter connectors, and you can see here that they are, let's punch in, they are a 3-pole 3.5 millimeter connector. However, what's kind of interesting is that the Hifiman Sundara actually uses this same kind of setup. It's got, right, let's see, I should be able to take these, plug them directly into the Sundara, and theoretically this will work. I haven't actually tried this, but what I have tried is using a couple of aftermarket cables that I have for the Sundara on the X3, one of which is a shorter cable, right? Pretty strangely, the right channel, this happened with both of my cables, so I'm not sure, I don't know that this is a cable thing. I'm wondering if this is a thing that's particular to the X3 cable. That cable, the aftermarket cables that I have for the Sundara will work here, but the right one will only work if it's like partially out. If I connect it all the way in, if I snap it all the way in, the right channel goes out. It just dies. And that happens with both cables, which makes me think that it's not necessarily just a problem with the connectors on those cables, but maybe there is some, I don't know, proprietary magic going on here in the Fidelio X3 cable. Which, if that's the case, and I think this is the sort of thing that should, you know, it should take more testing than what I have at my disposal. But if that's the case, that's actually kind of disappointing because it means that it's going to be hard to replace the cable on the X3 with something shorter or just different. On the plus side, you know, it was nice that Fidelio, or that Philips, gives you both. They actually give you 2 cables in the box, one of which is 3.5 millimeter termination, the other a balanced 2.5 millimeter termination. I think that's pretty cool, but frankly, they're just both way too long and I'm not a big fan of the cables. So there is that. All right, the last thing I was gonna mention, I should have mentioned this in the comfort bit, just a minor complaint, kind of a minor complaint. I think that this is just a little bit counter to the premium quality materials here, and maybe this doesn't bother you, but listen to this. The suspension strap, it makes a lot of noise on the head. And because it's kind of like always pulling itself off, well, always pulling itself up, I do find myself adjusting this thing fairly frequently. And every time you adjust it, you hear that scratchiness, again, you hear that scratchiness coming through the ear cups. Is that a big deal? I don't think so, but you know, this is a review, so I get to complain about little things like that. Yeah, I think that's about all I gotta say about the build and the physical aspects of the Fidelio X3. So let's just go ahead and talk about the sound quality, which is ostensibly the most important aspect of a headphone. I don't think it's necessarily the only thing that matters, but ostensibly it's the most important. So again, 350 bucks, this is not cheap. It is dynamic drivers, it's pretty large dynamic drivers. I think they're 50 millimeter drivers. I don't know that size of the driver necessarily means too much, but well, let's just start with my expectations, okay? The Fidelio X2 is it's still a pretty nice sounding headphone, you know, given all the different things I've listened to since I got that headphone. I actually do still like it. The X2 is known for a couple of things. One, it's known for fairly large sound stage, and that just means that the sound kind of sounds like it's coming a little bit more all around you, and rather than just from these speakers that are, you know, planted on either side of your head. The other thing that the X2 is quite known for is bass. It is a bassy headphone, especially for an open back. You know, it's kind of a V-shaped sound signature. It's got, you know, a little bit of treble zing, but definitely has a bass emphasis on it that I think makes the X2 a very fun sounding headphone, combined especially with that sound stage that I described. The X2 is just a fun headphone. And now that you can get the X2 for well under 200 bucks, I think it's still a pretty strong recommendation. But those kind of expectations I had when I went into the X3, especially given some of the similarities in terms of build quality, same 50mm dynamic driver, very similar pads, and including some similar construction underneath the pads. And what you get is some similarities. I think there is some familiar similarities between this and the X2. I think for one, the soundstage on this is still standout. I think that, and we'll get into the comparisons a little bit more in depth, but I think that the soundstage here on the X3 does stand out versus a lot of other headphones in this price range. The other character that I think stands out is sort of the treble character, whereas the X2, I described it as a V. It's got a bit of a treble zing to it to kind of complement the big bass. And I think that these still have a kind of similar treble quality to them, right? So they've got the elevated treble, but not just as elevated. It's got like a bit of like that kind of, I don't know. It's just a bit of a fiery hot treble, but only in kind of like a narrow band. And I find like that was kind of similar here with the X3. But the big difference here with the X3s and the X2s, and this is probably going to be roughly the end of my comparison between these and the X2s, is that these are not as bassy as the X2. In fact, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but they kind of went for closer to a neutral sound signature, I would say. Now we'll just kind of get into describing the signature of this. I would describe this as still sort of a V-shaped sound signature, but much more leaning toward upper mid-range and treble, less so on the bass. There is still some bass emphasis, but not nearly as much as what you got on the X2s. Versus the X2, I think this is a leaner sounding headphone. It's a brighter sounding headphone because of that. And frankly, I found it quite a bit more fatiguing to listen to. So let's go ahead and head to the table and get into some of these comparisons with these just two other headphones. And I'll kind of go through these things, right? So I gave you the overall signature. Both of these headphones I would describe as more neutral than this, but they're kind of all, different flavors of neutral. So we'll get into that. And I'll start by just talking about, some of the technicals of these three headphones. I mentioned that the staging on the X3s is pretty standout, and I think that holds true versus these two headphones. Frankly, the 600s, the HD600s here, and the Sundaras, neither of these headphones are especially known for their soundstage, and I think that the X3 soundstage is pretty clearly wider and just larger sounding headphone than these two. Whether or not that's the thing that you need, I've kind of found myself just finding that soundstage isn't actually the thing that I care the most about. More for my interest is actually the quality of the imaging, the distinction in the layering of the sounds, and sort of the precision positioning of them, which I think all three of these headphones actually do pretty well. If I were to rank these in terms of soundstage, this is kind of how I'd rank them, right? X3s and these two are about equal. If I were to rank them in terms of imaging qualities, however, I might rank them closer to this. Maybe the Sundara's slightly stronger imaging than the Sennheisers, and both of these are maybe a fair bit above the X3s, but I don't think the X3s are necessarily a slouch in that aspect. I did describe that these things have a bit of a treble zing to them, and not always, but typically, having some emphasis in the treble is associated with slightly stronger imaging. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that does hold true here. Maybe it's just not, because it's got that wider soundstage, it's a little bit less precise, or it's less clear what direction and pinpoint positioning of sounds you get versus these two headphones, which maybe they don't muddle that positioning as much by trying to sound wide, so they are a little bit stronger there. So which of those you prefer, again, that's totally up to you, but that's just kind of how I see it. Now, in terms of like raw detail, which I don't know, the detail is kind of an interesting subject in audio, because I don't think it actually means the thing that it sounds like it means, right? Like when I initially started hearing people talk about detail in headphones, I expected that I would listen to something on that headphone and I would hear something that I don't hear on another headphone, like a very specific sound, and that's not really the case. Like there might be some headphones that a sound will stand out more on another headphone, but if that's a sound like you never heard in a different song, Let's say you have a song, you're hearing it on a new headphone, you hear a sound that you never heard before. Chances are you go to a headphone you have listened to before and you listen for that sound, you're probably going to hear it. So detail doesn't necessarily quite mean that, but detail just kind of comes across more as like just, I don't know, it's more of a sense than it is a very specific thing. So I'm just kind of caveating what I'm going to say here about detail. How I would rank these in terms of detail, again, I would kind of drop the X3s a little bit lower, and I would say that detail between, I've got this plant here in the way, but I would say that detail on the HD600 is a little bit stronger than the detail on the Sundara, especially here in the mid-range, which this is just, spoilers, this is a very strong mid-range headphone. So that's kind of how I'd rank them detail-wise, right? These two are roughly equal, maybe a slight mid-range advantage here, and then this is, you know, not far behind, but maybe a little bit behind in terms of detail. Now we can get into talking about the different frequencies, right? And I did talk about these all being roughly different shades of neutral. I would say that this is a little bit sort of a bright V, right? There is a little bit more bass emphasis and a little bit more treble emphasis in the mid-range. There is actually some upper mid-range emphasis here too. So I don't want to suggest that this doesn't have some mid-range emphasis on it as well. The Sennheiser HD600, I would say that this is a lot of upper mid-range emphasis, whereas the Sundara is a little bit more flat. I would say that the Sundara is probably the closest to sounding neutral to my ear. But yeah, let's just start by talking about bass, I guess. And I think that this one does have kind of the more clear bass emphasis, but it's not necessarily a lot of bass, especially compared to something like the X2s, which clearly sound like they've got a lot of bass. Here, the bass emphasis feels like it's more of like a mid-bass bump, but it's still fairly lean. I don't think that the bass extends especially well here, but it doesn't also extend especially well here on the Sennheisers. So yeah, not a ton of like sub-bass emphasis, at least to my ear. A little bit of mid-bass bump to it, and it gives it a nice texture, but I think maybe the quality of the bass here is not as strong as what you get here on the Sundara. I mean, before jumping into the Sundara, I'll just quickly talk about the HD600s, which these are not known for their bass. They're pretty decent bass quality, but it is more mid-bass focus, kind of rolls off in the sub-bass region. Whereas here with the Sundara, you get a little bit more of that sub-bass extension. Not a ton, but you do get a little bit more of that sub-bass extension. I think just generally the bass quality on the Sundara it does stand out above these other two headphones. There is not just that additional extension in the sub-bass frequencies, but I think that also just the tightness of the bass, the definition, the tone, and the texture comes across stronger here than it does in either of these headphones. So if I were to rank these things in terms of bass, I would say these things roughly equal, and the Sundara is a pretty clear advantage. Now in the mid-range, I would describe this, again, I describe here the X3 as sort of a V-shaped sound with that treble emphasis, but there is also some upper mid-range emphasis. I think the lower mid-range kind of takes a hit from that, and it keeps it a relatively lean sounding headphone. The mid-range here on the Sundara does also have maybe a bit of upper mid-range emphasis, but I think less so than either of these two headphones. Whereas here with the X2s, not that X2s, wow, that's the HD600. Come on, bro, respect. Here with the the HD600s, this is my mid-range benchmark. I love the mid-range on this headphone. Just the quality and the resolution that comes through on vocals with this headphone is super, super strong. They are a little bit forward. For folks who are allergic to forward vocals, this might be, you might prefer like the Sennheiser HD650 versus the 600. My personal preference, however, is for the 600. And so where does that leave us? I just think that mid-range, you know, I would say that the 600s, I think pretty strong advantage. I would say the Sundaras are fairly close behind, but a little bit behind, and then the mid-range on the X3s is unfortunately a little bit down here. Maybe not quite down there, but that's as much room as I have on my table. And then we get to the treble, and this is where I think, so I left treble for last because this is gonna be, I think, the big difference maker. All three of these are somewhat on the bright side. Like I think none of these are like warm, syrupy, bassy headphones. These are all somewhat on the bright side, to varying degrees, all right? So this has got that upper mid-range emphasis, but I think the treble on here is actually a tad relaxed and just super, super smooth. The treble here makes zero mistakes on the HD600. And that just makes this just a really comfortable listen for hours and hours and hours. The Sundara treble, I think, is got maybe a little bit stronger definition than the treble here on the HD600, but it can come across a little bit blunt at times. That's just me being, picky about the Sundara. I think that the treble quality here is not quite as good as it is here on the HD600, but then that brings us to the Fidelio X3. And unfortunately, I think the treble on this headphone is kind of a problem. The treble on the X3, I've already described it a couple of times as having some emphasis. It is just a bit on the hot side. This is one of the more fatiguing headphones, maybe the most fatiguing headphone I have. Let's see. I mean, maybe I should compare it directly to my Grado SR80s, which are also kind of treble hot headphones, but I have a feeling I'm gonna find the Grados less fatiguing than these, frankly. And this is actually a comparison I should have made earlier in the review. The treble and a lot of the character of the sound of this headphone kind of reminds me the most of the Sony MDR V6, right? Which is sort of a monitoring headphone. It's got fairly strong and emphasized treble, which can be good for monitoring production and making sure that you're cutting out the S's in your audio and any sharpness. But unfortunately, if you're just kind of using this casually and listening to music, if you're listening to music that has those sharp S's, the X3 is going to be one of those headphones that really plays it up to, I find, a pretty fatiguing degree. Now, if you've been following my channel, you know that I am still a bit of a treble head. Like I like bright sounding headphones. I don't like warm and syrupy typically. And that's kind of why you see this arrangement of headphones here, right? These two headphones, I quite love the sound of. This one, I want to love the sound of. However, I do find that treble is just a bit of a problem. So yeah, if I were to rank these things in terms of treble, I think that the HD600 is sort of the clear winner here. The Sundara, not too far behind there, but then the X3, I think, wow, this is not a beautiful arrangement, but the X3, I would say, is clearly in last place in terms of treble. So there you go. I don't know. That's the Philips Fidelio X3. I should go ahead and give this thing a rating, which I'll go ahead and do right now. I think out of 5 stars, I give the Fidelio X3 3 stars. It's not a bad headphone. This thing does a lot of things pretty competently. Again, I like the build material, and I think that it's going to get more comfortable with time. I think it's also going to become more attractive with time, which might seem like a weird thing to say until you look at something like these ugly Sennheisers, which I think just look so cool now. I think that's kind of what these things are going to be like, but they're not starting from as bad a position. Fairly nice materials, comfort's just not the strongest, which is a little bit of a bummer. And then the sound, again, like there's a lot of competencies here. That soundstage is really nice. It's not the strongest in either bass, mid-range, or treble of all these 3 headphones. In fact, the treble I find to be a little bit problematic here. And unfortunately, at $350, there's just really stiff competition. In fact, frankly, I prefer the Fidelio X2, which you can still get for like $150, maybe a little bit cheaper. That's kind of where I'm at with the Fidelio X3. If you're still interested in checking this thing out, of course, I've got a link in the description down below, and while you're down there, if you like this review, you found this helpful and informative, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you want more reviews like this, and if you want to be part of the next live stream, please ding the bell. YouTube will let you know when I'm live, and then we can have a little conversation like we're about to have right now. That is the end of this review. Thank you guys for watching. If you want the Q&A, stick around.